The foreign commander laughed before he had even reached the top of the stair, and the sound of it carried down the whole length of the east colonnade, bright and careless, the laugh of a man who had already decided what he was looking at. I heard it before I saw him. I was posted at the head of the King's Stair that morning, at the arch where the ceremonial route from the harbor gate turns up into the court of reception, and my orders were the same they had been for 11 years. Stand the line, hold the honor, let no unescorted person pass the arch, and do not, under any circumstance short of a drawn blade or a raised alarm, speak or move from the post. I had held that arch through rain that filled my boots and heat that made the buckles too hot to touch. I had held it through a state funeral when the whole realm wept and I did not. Stillness was not a difficulty for me. It was the shape my body had learned. So I did not turn my head when the commander came up the stair with his aides around him, and the king's own steward, Master Aldous, walking a half-pace ahead and slightly bent, the way Aldous always walked when he was managing a guest he did not like. I kept my eyes level, fixed on the far pillar as I had been trained, and I let the man arrive. He was broad through the shoulders and gone a little heavy through the middle, in the way of a soldier who has left the field for the council table, but has not yet forgiven his own waistline for it. His coat was the deep sea blue of the Moravian coast delegation. That is not the true name of his country, and I will use no true name here, for the men of that shore have a long memory, and I am telling this only for the record of what happened, not to shame a nation, and it was heavy with the braid and the medals of a man who had climbed high. He had a clean gray beard, close-cut, and eyes that moved fast and took inventory. He stopped 3 paces from me, planted his boots, and looked me up and down the way a man looks at a horse he has been told is expensive and does not believe it. "This," he said in our tongue well spoken, "is what they were so eager to show me." Master Aldous made the small sound stewards make. "Commander Havard, the household guard stands the ceremonial route to the court of reception. The king wished you to be received with full honor." "Full honor," the commander repeated, and he smiled, and I understood that the smile was the beginning of a performance he intended to give for the benefit of his own aides, 3 younger officers who had arranged themselves behind him, and were already smiling in advance the way men smile when their commander is about to be clever. He walked a slow circle around me. I have had men walk around me before. It is not a comfortable thing to be examined like a statue in a gallery by a man who could, if he chose, put his hand on your rifle, and to be forbidden to turn and watch him do it. But that discomfort had long ago stopped reaching the part of me that decides anything. I breathed slow. I kept the far pillar. "Look at the boots," Havard said to his aides. "Look at the mirror on them. Do you know how many hours a man spends on boots like that? Hours, every day. And the tunic wool in this heat buttoned to the throat so he may stand in a doorway and be looked at." He came back around into my line of sight, and now he leaned in, and I could smell the salt and the oil of a man freshly off a ship, and under it the wine of a long, welcome luncheon. "You are a decoration, aren't you?" he said, softly, not unkindly, the way you might speak to a child who does not know he is being condescended to. "A very fine, very expensive decoration. They polish you and they set you in the doorway so the visitors can say, 'Ah, look at the discipline of this old kingdom, look how still their soldiers stand.' And it is very pretty, and it means nothing at all." I said nothing. Saying nothing was the whole of my duty, and I was good at it, and I want to be honest with you about what was underneath the nothing, because that is the part of this story worth telling. Underneath the nothing I was not offended. A man who has done the work I have done does not need a foreign commander to certify it. What I felt, standing there while he circled me and lectured my stillness, was something closer to a kind of tired patience. The patience of a locksmith listening to a man explain that locks are only decoration, while the locksmith knows that the door will hold or fail on a day the man has not imagined, and that on that day the man will be very glad the lock was more than it looked. In my service, Havard went on, warming now, playing to the aides and to Aldous both. We do not keep men to be looked at. A soldier who cannot be spared for the wall is not a soldier. We would have you carrying powder or standing a real watch, not this. He gestured at the whole colonnade, the gilded rail, the long red runner up the stair, the tourists, for we admitted small chaperone parties to the outer court on reception days, gathered at the lower balustrade with their eyes wide. Ceremony, he said, and he said it the way another man might say rot. You have built a whole army out of ceremony. It photographs beautifully. And the day something real comes up that stair, all your polish will be exactly as useful as a painting of a wall. Master Aldous had gone the particular gray of a man watching a state visit tilt toward an incident. "Commander," he began, "perhaps we might proceed to the court. His Majesty is—" A moment, Havard held up a hand. He was enjoying himself. He turned to the nearest of his aides, a lean young officer with a duelist's easy balance, and said something in their own tongue, and the young man laughed and answered, and two of them looked at me with the frank curiosity of men appraising an antique. Then Havard turned back and did the thing that I have thought about many times since, because it was so small and so exactly the wrong thing. He reached out and flicked with 2 fingers the brim of my bearskin, not hard, not a blow, just a flick, the way a boy flicks a bell to hear if it rings. It rocked the tall fur a half-inch and settled. It was nothing. It was also, by every law of the household, a laying of hands on a guard at his post, and by the old code it was a thing for which men had once been sent home from court in disgrace. He did it to see if I would react. He did it because he had decided I was a decoration, and a man tests a decoration by touching it and watching it not move. I did not move. I did not blink. I held the far pillar and I let the insult land and go past me like the others, and I saw, at the edge of my vision, Master Aldous close his eyes for one long second as though praying. "You see," said Commander Havard, delighted, spreading his hands to his aides, to Aldous, to the whole morning. "Nothing. There is nothing behind it. A fine decoration." And he turned, satisfied, and let Aldous lead him at last up toward the court of reception, and his aides went laughing after him, and the tourists at the balustrade murmured and pointed, and I stood in the arch with the print of 2 fingers still cooling on the brim of my cap and thought, with no heat in it at all, you have no idea what you just walked past. I want to set down here plainly who I was, because the whole weight of what came later hangs on it, and because Commander Havard was not entirely wrong. He was wrong about me. He was not wrong that the man beside him, that most of the men who stood the ceremonial route, were, in the sense he meant, decorations. Fine young soldiers, drilled and proud, chosen for their height and their bearing and their steadiness in a crowd, and if a real thing came up the stair, most of them would meet it with courage and with the 6 months of arms training the household gives, and that would have to be enough. Ceremony was most of their trade, and there is no shame in it. The honor of a throne is a real thing that real men hold up, and holding it up well is not nothing. But the household has always kept, threaded quietly through its ranks, a small number of men who are not decorations at all, men who came to the red tunic from somewhere else. We are not marked. We wear the same wool, the same fur, the same white gloves, and we stand the same posts, and that is the entire point, that you cannot tell, looking at the line, which of the still figures is a young man of good family doing his 3 years of ceremonial service, and which is a man who spent a decade in the marches doing work the realm does not put in its songs. I was the second kind. Before the red tunic I had served 11 years in the Warden's Reach, the King's shadow service, the men who go out along the frontier and into the mountain passes and do the quiet, ugly, necessary work of keeping a border a border. I had led a hunting party through the Coldwater passes for 2 winters. I had cleared a fortified smuggler's hold at Ashford with 9 men against 40, and brought 7 of the 9 home. I had learned in that service 3 things that a ceremonial guard is never taught and that I never forgot: how to read a crowd for the one wrong man in it, how to close distance faster than a frightened person can bring a weapon to bear, and how to make a decision in the half-second before the thing you fear has fully happened. Because in that work, the man who waits for certainty is the man who buries his friends. I had left the Reach with a bad shoulder, and a decoration I was not allowed to wear in public, and an offer, quietly made, to see out my service in the household, where the king liked to have a few such men standing in plain sight among the ceremonial line, precisely because no one would ever guess they were there. I had taken it. 11 years of arches and stairs and reins. 11 years of being looked at by men like Havard and thought a decoration. I had made my peace with it. The peace was this: I would rather stand 1,000 mornings being flicked on the cap by fools than have the realm need me and find no one in the doorway. So when Commander Havard called me a decoration and walked on, I did not correct him. That was not the day for correcting him. I did not yet know that the day for correcting him was already coming up the harbor road, and that it would arrive within the hour, and that it would come not for me but for a small person who had done nothing to deserve it, and that the whole question of whether ceremony meant nothing would be answered in front of the man who had asked it, in about the time it takes to draw a breath and let it out. Let me tell you how the morning was arranged, because the shape of it matters. It was the second day of the state visit. Commander Havard led the military portion of a coastal delegation come to renew an old accord of safe passage, the sort of business that is done with speeches and dinners and a great deal of standing about in fine clothes, and that everyone treats as ceremony precisely because, when it works, nothing ever comes of it but more peace. The king had ordered full honors. The delegation had been received at the harbor gate, walked up the ceremonial route past the ranks of the household, and would that morning be presented in the court of reception, after which there was to be a review of the guard in the great forecourt, and then a luncheon, and then the tedious signing of the accord itself. And because it was a day of honor, and because the king believed rightly, I still think that a state visit should show a foreign guest not just the strength of a throne but the life of it, the royal family were present. King Alaric himself, gray now and slower than the portraits, seated in the court under the canopy. The Crown Prince Rowan beside him, straight-backed and watchful, the way Rowan always was in his father's presence, ready to carry a weight the old king would not yet set down. Princess Ilara, Rowan's wife, whom the people loved and who had a way of making a stiff court feel briefly like a home. And their children, for it had been decided, over some objection from the more cautious voices, that the young ones should attend the review in the forecourt, so that the delegation might see the whole house, and so that the children might begin to learn, as royal children must, how to stand in a great and boring occasion and not disgrace it. The eldest, Prince Torin, was 11, and had reached the age where he thought ceremony beneath him, and stood through it with the pained dignity of a boy pretending he is not counting the minutes. The youngest, Prince Bram, was 6, and had been left in the care of a nurse in the shaded gallery above the forecourt, because 6 is too young for a review, and everyone knew it. And between them, 9 years old and by far the most dangerous of the 3 to the smooth running of any occasion, was Princess Malin. I knew Malin. Every guard on the palace side knew Malin. She was a solemn, watchful child with her late grandmother's dark eyes, the eyes of Queen Isolde, the king's first wife, dead these 6 years and still mourned in the quieter rooms of the palace, and she had a habit, unusual in a royal child, of actually seeing the guards. Most people of the court walked past us as they walked past the pillars. Malin had, since she was very small, made a private study of us. She knew which of us stood which posts. She had names for some of us that were not our names. She had once, at the age of 7, walked the whole length of the long gallery, matching her small, slow steps to the rhythm of my march at the changing of the watch, gravely, all the way, and then looked up at me at the end with enormous satisfaction, as though we had accomplished something together, which in a way we had. She was, in short, exactly the kind of child who would not stand quietly through a long review, not out of ill discipline, but out of a fierce, restless attention to everything around her. And it was that attention, that habit of truly seeing, that would matter more than anyone's speeches before the morning was out. But I am getting ahead of the stair. Let me go back to the arch, and to the print of 2 fingers on my cap, and to the thing that came up the harbor road while Commander Havard was still congratulating himself on his eye for decorations. The thing that came up the road was a cart. I would not have looked at it twice. I was posted at the head of the stair, not the harbor gate, and a cart on a delivery road is the least remarkable object in a working palace, except that a man who has spent 11 years in the Reach does not entirely stop looking, ever, at anything that moves toward the people he is set to guard. It is not a thing you decide to do. It is a thing that has been done to you, worn into you by 2 winters of watching a tree line for the wrongness that means an ambush. So even standing my ceremonial arch, even with the print of Havard's fingers still on my cap, some old part of me was quartering the ground below, the way it always did, and it caught on the cart. The cart came in through the tradesman's gate at the lower wall, where the day's provisions for the luncheon were being brought up, casks and crates, and the long flat boxes of cut flowers for the tables. There were 3 or 4 such carts already in the lower yard, and the palace victuallers moving among them with their lists, and the whole of it was ordinary, and the cart that caught my eye was ordinary too at first. A plain covered dray, a single tired horse, a driver in a carter's smock and a wide hat. What caught me was not the cart, it was the driver's hands. I was too far to see a face, but I have learned to read a man by his hands and his weight, because in the passes a face can be schooled and hands very rarely are, and this driver's hands were wrong on the reins. They were too high and too tight, and they kept moving, adjusting, regripping, the way a man's hands move when the rest of him is holding very still on purpose, and the fear has to go somewhere. A tired carter at the end of a delivery holds the reins loose and low, and lets the horse walk itself in. This man was gripping his reins like a rail on a pitching deck, and his eyes, I could not see his eyes, but I could see the tilt of the wide hat, and it was not tilted at his horse or his load. It was tilted up. He was looking up, again and again, at the forecourt above, where the canopies were, where the honors would be, where the royal family were even now gathering for the review. I felt the old cold thing turn over in my chest, the thing the Reach gives you and does not take back. Watch that one. I could not move. That was the whole cruelty of the post and the whole discipline of it. I was a ceremonial guard at the head of the King's Stair. My orders forbade me to leave the arch for anything short of a drawn blade or a raised alarm, and a nervous carter is neither. If I stepped down from my post and walked to the lower yard on the strength of a driver's hands, and I was wrong, I would have abandoned the honor of the route during a state visit on a whim, and the household does not forgive that, and Commander Havard, when he heard of it, would have had the finest morning of his life. You see, he would say, even the decoration cannot be trusted to stand still. It gets frightened of a flower cart and runs. So I did the only thing the post allowed. I watched, and I did the arithmetic of the ground, the way you do when you cannot act yet but you can be ready. The cart was in the lower yard. Between the lower yard and the forecourt where the family stood, there was the ramp of the tradesman's way, then the service arch, then the open colonnade that ran along the side of the forecourt itself, and that colonnade was where a delivery would be halted and unloaded, well back from the honors, screened by the guard of the day and the victuallers. For the cart to reach the family, it would have to pass the service arch, and the service arch had a guard on it, young Corwin, a good lad, 2 years in, a decoration in Havard's sense, a fine steady boy who had never in his life had to decide anything in the half-second before it happened. And the driver was looking up at the forecourt, not at the unloading dock, at the honors. I marked the distances the way I had been taught to mark them and never unlearn it. Arch to lower yard, 80 paces and a stair. Corwin at the service arch. He would stop a cart. He was drilled to stop a cart, but he would stop it politely, with a raised hand and a question, because That is what he had been trained to do, and no one had ever trained him for the other thing. And a man who is holding his fear that tightly, a man who has looked up at the family that many times, is not a man who will be turned back by a polite raised hand. He is a man who has already decided. I have been asked since how I knew. I did not know. That is the truth of it, and I will not dress it up. I did not have a certainty. I had a driver's hands and a tilted hat, and 11 years of a service that teaches you to trust exactly that and act on it, because the men who wait for certainty are the men who arrive too late. Commander Havard would have called it nothing. He would have been right that it was, by any ceremonial measure, nothing. And that is the whole argument between us, the commander and me, made flesh in a flower cart. He believed that until a thing has openly declared itself, there is nothing to do but stand and be looked at. I believed, I had buried friends over the difference, that the whole art is in the moment before the thing declares itself, and that a man set to guard who will not read the ground until the blade is out is not a guardian at all. He is a decoration. He was right about that word. He had simply misapplied it. I could not leave my post, but I could send. There is a thing we do in the household that the tourists never notice, and that Commander Havard, for all his contempt, did not know to look for. The ceremonial line is not as deaf and dumb as it appears. We hold hand signals, small, disciplined, invisible unless you know them, for the passing of word along a line of men who may not speak or turn. A guard who sees a thing his post forbids him to leave can pass it, hand to hand, down the whole route, until it reaches a man who is free to move. It is slow. It is meant for the slow business of ceremony, a signal that a procession is late, that a rank should dress its line, that the king is rising. It was not meant for a flower cart with a frightened man on the box, but it was what I had. Below me, at the foot of the stair, stood Sergeant Halden of the day watch, a man I trusted, a man who could leave his position, a man who would know the sign. I brought my right hand in its white glove to the small of my rifle, and I gave slow, deliberate, holding my eyes forward the whole while so that not one tourist at the balustrade saw anything but a still soldier resting his hand. The sign for asterisk word passed, watch the low yard, a driver runs wrong. And I waited for Halden to catch it and pass it on, and I felt every second of the waiting as a distance the cart could close, and I stood in my arch with my heart doing the old cold work and my face doing the ceremonial nothing. And above me in the forecourt, someone struck up the first flourish of the review, and the horns went up bright and gold into the morning, and the whole beautiful machine of the honors began to turn, exactly as if nothing at all were coming up the ramp toward the children. Sergeant Halden caught the sign. I saw his head come round a fraction, saw him find me, saw him read my glove. And then I will not pretend the machine worked as it should have, because it did not, and the failure is part of the truth. Halden did the correct and cautious thing, the thing the standing orders told him to do, which was not to charge the low yard but to pass the word asterisk up to the officer of the day for a decision. Which was right. Which was, on any ordinary morning, exactly right, and which cost us the very minutes the driver was spending on the ramp. Because while the word went up the proper channel, hand to hand, careful and slow and correct, the cart moved. I watched it move. I watched the tired horse lean into the collar and take the ramp, and I watched the driver's tilted hat swing up one more time toward the forecourt, and I watched Corwin at the service arch step out with his hand raised, and his polite question already forming on his good young face. And I did the arithmetic one final time, and the arithmetic came out the way I had feared it would come out from the moment I saw the hands. The word will not arrive in time. The officer will decide, and he will decide well, and it will be too late, because the cart is already at the arch and Corwin does not know how to stop a man who has decided. And in that moment the whole 11 years of the reach rose up in me and said the thing it had said in the passes, the thing that had kept me alive and cost me my shoulder. The orders are for the ordinary morning. This is not the ordinary morning. Move. I moved. I want to be exact about what moving meant, because in the telling, since it has grown into something it was not, a charge, a heroic sprint, a soldier flying down a staircase with his rifle high. It was none of those things. A man who has done real work does not charge. Charging is for stories. What I did was leave my post, and there is a discipline even in that, even in the breaking of it. I did not shout. Shouting empties a stair of the very information you need and fills it with panic, and a panicked crowd between you and the threat is worse than no crowd at all. I stepped back off the honor line, turned, and went down the king's stair fast and controlled. On the balls of my feet, my rifle brought across my body where it would not swing and foul me. My eyes already down in the lower yard and locked on the cart, reading, still reading, because the reading never stops until the thing is over. Behind me I heard a voice, one of the balustrade tourists, or perhaps Master Aldous returning, I never learned, cry out in surprise, the small sound of a person watching a statue come alive. Let them cry out. Let the whole colonnade wonder why the decoration had left its plinth. I had 80 paces and a stair between me and the service arch, and the cart was already at the arch, and there was no more time in the world for wondering. Down in the yard it was happening the way I had read it. Corwin had stepped out from the service arch, his white glove raised, his good young face polite and firm, saying the drilled thing, "Hold there, friend, this way for the unloading. The dock is to your left." And the driver was not holding and was not turning left. The tired horse had its head down and its shoulders in the collar, and it was walking, slow and steady and terrible, straight at the arch and the boy in it. And the driver on the box had his tilted hat up toward the forecourt one last time and then down, fixed, on the gap past Corwin's shoulder, on the open colonnade beyond that ran along the side of the honors, and I saw his near hand leave the reins and go down beside him on the box, down to where a long shape lay under a fold of sacking. And I knew that shape the way you know a face you have hated, and everything in me went very cold and very quiet and very fast. I was perhaps 40 paces off now, coming down the last of the stair into the yard, and I did the last arithmetic, the one that the reach beats into you until it is faster than thought. 40 paces. He is at the arch. Corwin is between us and does not see the shape. If I call out, the driver breaks for the colonnade now and I lose the yard. If I close silent, I have him in 10 seconds, and 10 seconds is too long if that shape comes up. Change the driver's problem. Make him deal with me instead of the gap. So I did the one thing I could do with my voice that would help instead of harm. I did not cry alarm to the yard. I gave a command to one man in the flat, hard, carrying voice of the reach, a voice I had not used in 11 years, and that came up out of me whole. Corwin. Step left. Now. The good young guard did not understand, but he had been drilled all his life to obey exactly that tone from exactly that kind of voice, and he stepped left, out of the line between the horse and the colonnade, out of the driver's path, and though he did not know it, out of the way of what was about to come off that box. And the driver, who had been managing one soldier, a polite boy with a raised glove, now had a second soldier coming at him fast and silent from the flank with a rifle across his body, and a voice like the closing of a gate, and the fear that had been leaking out of his hands all the way up the road broke its banks, and he did what frightened men who have decided always do a fraction too early. He grabbed for the long shape under the sacking and stood up on the box to bring it round. It was a fowling piece, a long single-barreled bird gun, old and ill-kept, the kind a poor man keeps in a shed, cut down short at the stock so it could be hidden under a smock. Not a soldier's weapon, a desperate man's weapon. And a fowling piece at that range, brought up in a hurry by a shaking man standing on a swaying cart, is a lethal and clumsy and unaimed thing. And unaimed is the most dangerous thing of all when there are people beyond it, because it will not go where he points it. It will go where the panic and the horse's next step send it. I could see, past the cart, past the service arch, the near edge of the forecourt colonnade, and along that colonnade, drawn by the flourish of the horns and the bright arriving delegation, small figures at the rail. Court children. and nearest the rail, alone for the length of one careless minute where a nurse had turned to answer the Princess Alara. I did not see her then. I have only pieced it since from what others said. A small figure with dark eyes who saw everything, who had wandered a few steps from the group to watch the interesting cart come up the ramp, exactly as she had once walked the long gallery in time with my march. Malin was in the line of the barrel. The whole cruel arithmetic of the morning had put a 9-year-old at the rail behind a frightened man's fowling piece, and there was no time left. None, not for a word, not for a warning, not for the officer's careful decision now coming down the proper channel 3 minutes too late. There was only the distance and the half-second, and the half-second was mine. I did not shoot him. I want that on the record too, plainly, because the easy telling of this story has me raising my rifle and dropping the man in the yard, and I did no such thing, and if I had, I would have failed. A ceremonial rifle is a real weapon and I could have used it, but a shot in that yard, into a swaying cart, with a nervous horse, with the colonnade and the children beyond. A shot was the fowling piece's own madness answered in kind. A bad shot, or a good one that passed through, or the horse bolting at the crack of it straight up the ramp into the honors, no. The reach does not teach you to shoot your way out of a crowded yard. It teaches you the harder thing, the thing that takes 11 years and a ruined shoulder to learn. How to close the last distance faster than a frightened man can bring a weapon to bear, and end it with your hands. I dropped my rifle, slung it one motion across my back, because a rifle in your hands at 3 paces is a lever the other man can grab, and my hands were the weapon now. And I closed the last of the distance in the low, driving, silent run that is not a charge and not a sprint but a thing between them. The run you learn for the last 3 paces of a hold when the whole world has narrowed to one man's hands and what is in them, and I went in under the barrel. Under. That is the whole of it, the one piece of craft the entire morning turned on, and it is a piece of craft that Commander Havard, in all his contempt for ceremony, did not have, because it is not taught in an army that keeps its soldiers on walls. You do not go for a man's weapon from the front, where the muzzle is. You go for it from below and to the side, inside the arc, where the barrel cannot follow you fast enough, and you drive it up and away from the people while your other hand takes the man off his balance. The driver was standing on a swaying cart with the fowling piece coming round, and I came in under his line from the flank, and my left hand took the barrel and shoved it up and out, toward the empty sky over the lower wall, away from the arch, away from the colonnade, away from the small dark-eyed figure at the rail, and my right hand took a fistful of his smock and my weight took him off the box. The fowling piece went off. It went off into the sky, into nothing, the shot spending itself harmlessly against the morning over the lower wall, exactly where I had driven it, and the crack of it rolled across the yard and up the ramp, and into the forecourt where the horns had been playing, and the horns stopped, and the whole beautiful machine of the honors seized like a clock with a hand thrust into its gears. But the shot was in the sky. That was all that mattered in that half-second and all that has ever mattered since. The shot was in the sky, and I had the man, and we came down off the cart together onto the cobbles of the lower yard, hard, with the whole of my weight driving him down and the breath going out of him in a burst. And I had his gun arm bent up behind him and my knee across his back and my forearm bar across his shoulders before he had finished falling. In the pin the reach taught me, the one that ends a man's struggle without ending the man, because a live prisoner tells you why. And a dead one only makes a martyr. For a moment the yard was perfectly silent. Then the world came back all at once. The tired horse, spooked by the shot, half-reared in the traces and came down and stood trembling, and a victualler had the good sense to catch its head. The fowling piece lay on the cobbles where it had spun from the man's hand, and I kicked it back behind me, out of his reach, without lifting my knee from his spine. Corwin was there, good lad. He had recovered from the strangeness of the last 10 seconds and come in on my flank the instant the thing was down, which is all you can ask of any man, and I said to him, low and level, cord, wrists and elbows both. He is not done being dangerous. And Corwin got his ceremonial cord off his belt and bound the man's wrists, and then, at my word, his elbows too, drawn back. The way you bind a man you do not intend to let reach anything ever again. The driver was weeping. That is a thing they do not put in the songs either. He had stopped struggling the moment the pin took him. They always do. The pin is designed so that struggle only hurts. And now, face against the cobbles, wrists and elbows bound, he was weeping in great ugly heaves and saying a word over and over that I could not make out at first and then could. He was saying a name. A woman's name or a child's, I did not then know which. He was not saying it to me. He was saying it to the stones. I did not soften. Softening comes later, when you have learned the shape of a thing. In the yard you keep the man pinned and you keep reading, because a weeping man can still have a second weapon and a second purpose, and I did not yet know what this was, whether it was the whole of the threat or the first move of a larger one, whether there was a second cart, a second man, whether the fouling piece in the sky had been the true attack or a diversion for something worse coming up another road, while every eye in the palace turned to this yard. That is the discipline that outlasts the fight. The fight is the easy part. The not relaxing after is the hard part, and it is the part that keeps people alive. So even as the yard filled, and it filled fast now, guardsmen pounding down from the upper posts, the officer of the day arriving at last with the careful decision that events had made for him, victuallers and stewards crowding to the edges, I did not let go, and I did not stand, and I called out the things that needed calling. Second cart, has anyone eyes on a second cart? Clear the ramp. Get the family off the forecourt rail and inside now, do it quietly, do not run them. Anyone at the harbor gate, hold it shut. I gave the orders in the flat carrying voice, and men who had never taken an order from me in their lives took these, because there is a register of voice reaches that the body obeys before the mind has caught up, and mine had reached it, and the yard organized itself around it the way iron filings organize around a magnet. It was in the middle of that, my knee on the weeping man's back, my voice running the yard, my eyes still quartering the ramp for the second thing, that Commander Havard arrived at the top of the tradesmen's ramp and stopped. He had come down from the court of reception at the sound of the shot, with his aides and half the delegation behind him and Master Aldous somewhere in the press, because a gunshot during a state visit will bring every man of consequence to a railing to see whether he is about to become part of an international incident. And he arrived at the head of the ramp and looked down into the yard and saw, I have been told what he saw, and I have thought about it. He saw the decoration. He saw the still soldier from the arch, the fine expensive ornament he had flicked on the cap an hour before to prove it was hollow. Except the ornament was down in the working yard with its ceremonial rifle slung across its back and its bearskin knocked askew, and one knee on the spine of a bound and weeping man, and a fowling piece kicked out of reach on the cobbles, and the whole of the lower palace moving to the flat orders coming out of that same soldier's mouth. The ramp clearing, the gate holding, the family being drawn quietly off the rail, and inside exactly as the soldier had said. He saw a man who had crossed 80 paces and a staircase, and closed the last distance under a leveled gun, and put a live threat in the dirt without firing a shot. In the time, it had taken the commander himself to walk from the court to the railing. He saw, in other words, the precise opposite of everything he had said an hour before, doing the precise thing he had said it could never do. I did not look up at him. I had a prisoner and a yard and a second cart to rule out, and Commander Havard at that moment was the least important man on the ground. But I heard him. In the silence that had fallen at the top of the ramp, that particular silence of powerful men who do not yet know what they are looking at, I heard the young aide, the lean duelist, say something quick and low in their own tongue, a question, and I heard Havard answer him in one word. And though I did not have the tongue well, I had heard the word before in the passes, from prisoners and from allies both, and it does not translate cleanly, but it means something like that is a soldier. The whole word a professional gives, grudging and total, to another professional he has badly misjudged. He said it once, that word, and then he said nothing else for a long while, and I have always thought that the nothing else was the truer tribute. There was no second cart. It took us a hard quarter of an hour to be sure of that, and I did not release my prisoner or leave the yard until we were. Not until the harbor gate was confirmed shut and searched, not until every dray in the lower yard had been walked through and every crate opened, not until the ramp was clear and the family confirmed safe behind the inner doors. Only when Sergeant Haldon came to me himself, breathing hard, and said, "The house is closed, the family are inside the Rose Court, we have walked every cart and every man, there is no second thing." Only then did I let the fight go out of me and stand, and hand the weeping man off to the officer of the day with the words that needed saying. He is bound wrists and elbows. He wept a name the whole while. Treat him as a man to be questioned, not a man to be punished, until we know what drove him. There is more here than one desperate morning. I will tell you now what drove him, though I did not learn all of it until later, because it belongs in the honest telling, and because it is the part that keeps this from being a story about a hero and a villain, which is a shape I distrust. The driver's name I will not give. He has a family and they did nothing. He was not a soldier of any enemy, not an agent of the coastal delegation's rivals, not part of any plot. He was a tenant farmer from the near country who had lost his land, lost it in one of the quiet, legal, grinding ways that men lose land, a bad season and a hard lender, and a court that found for the lender, and who had come to believe, in the way that grief and ruin can make a man believe a thing that is not true, that the whole apparatus of the throne had done it to him, that the honors and the ceremonies and the fine wool tunics were paid for out of exactly the ruin of men like him, and that if he could only make the great machine stop and look at him, even for a moment, even at the cost of everything, then it would have meant something. He had not, I think, truly meant to kill anyone. I have turned this over many times and I believe it. He had meant to fire into the air, to make the horns stop and the great men turn to be seen. The name he wept was his daughter's. She had been taken sick in the losing of the land and had not recovered, and he had decided in the ruin of his mind that the palace owed her a reckoning. I say this not to excuse him. He brought a loaded gun up a ramp toward a rail where children stood, and whatever he meant, an unaimed fowling piece does not care what a man meant. But because the whole argument of the morning, the argument between the commander and me about whether ceremony means anything, was answered twice over by that broken farmer, and the second answer is deeper than the first. The first answer was mine, in the yard. Ceremony is not empty, because the discipline underneath it is real, and on the one morning in 10,000 when the real thing comes up the ramp, it is the discipline and not the polish that stands between a gun and a child. But the second answer was the farmer's, and it cut the other way, and I have never let myself forget it. Ceremony can also be a wall that hides real men in real ruin from the sight of the throne, and a kingdom that lets its honors become a way of not seeing its own broken people is building, cart by cart, the very thing that came up that ramp. Both are true. A guard who only believes the first and never the second is, in his own way, as much a decoration as Havard thought I was. But that reckoning came later. In the yard, in the first minutes after, there was only the settling of the thing, and the family and the king. They brought the king down. I had not expected it, and it was against every counsel of caution. The officer of the day had the family safely closed in the Rose Court, and there was no reason on earth to bring the sovereign into a yard where a gun had gone off a quarter-hour before. But King Alaric was old and stubborn and had been a soldier himself once, long ago, before the crown made him careful, and when he understood what had happened in his lower yard and who had ended it, he came down. He came down slowly, on the arm of the Crown Prince Rowan with the guard thick around them both, and he came across the cobbles to where I stood, and I straightened and made the salute. And I was aware, suddenly and absurdly, that my bearskin was knocked askew, and my tunic was fouled with the grime of the yard, and there was blood on my white glove, the driver's, from where he had struck his mouth on the cobbles, a small thing, and that I was in that moment the least ceremonial figure in the whole palace. And standing in front of my king, Alaric looked at me for a long moment. He was not a demonstrative man. The crown had worn the demonstration out of him. But he looked at me, and at the fowling piece on the cobbles, and at the bound man being led away, and at the rail of the forecourt above where his grandchildren had stood, and something moved in the old face that I had never seen there in 11 years of standing his posts. "They tell me," he said at last quietly, so that only the near ones heard, "that you left your arch." "I did, Majesty," I said, "against orders." "I will answer for it." "You will answer for it," the king agreed, and there was the ghost of something in his voice, and he reached out and with 2 fingers, the same 2 fingers, though he could not have known it, that a foreign commander had used to flick my cap an hour before. He straightened, very gently, the brim of my knocked-askew bearskin, setting it right, the way a father sets right the collar of a son who has been in a fight. "You will answer for it," he said again, "at the luncheon, sitting at my right hand where I can hear the whole of it. That is the answering I require." And he turned and let Rowan lead him back up out of the yard, and that was the whole of the king's reward, and it was more than any medal, and every man in the yard understood it. It was Princess Malin who told me later how close it had truly been, closer than the arithmetic in the yard had let me feel, because in the moment you do not feel closeness, you only feel the work. The feeling comes for you afterward at night and takes its payment. She had not been meant to be at the rail. That much I gathered from the low, controlled fury with which the nurse was being spoken to inside the rose court, and from the way Princess Alara held the child against her side for the rest of that day, and would not for hours let her more than an arm's length off. Malin had wandered 3-4 steps, no more, the way a curious 9-year-old wanders in a boring occasion when the adults are occupied with an arriving delegation, and there is an interesting cart coming up a ramp. 3 or 4 steps had carried her to the near end of the colonnade rail, into the sight line of the lower yard, into the sight line, when it came to it, of the barrel. And she had been watching the cart because Malin watched everything, and so she had seen, she told me this herself, days later in the grave exact way she had seen, the man on the cart pick up the long thing, and she had seen the guard from the arch come down the stair, and she had understood in the immediate wordless way that children sometimes understand a danger the adults around them are still explaining to each other, that the long thing and the guard and she herself were all on one line, and that something very bad was about to be decided on it. "I didn't move," she told me, and her dark eyes, Isolde's eyes, were very steady on mine. "I know you're supposed to run, but I looked and I saw it was you coming down the stair, and I knew you would get there. So I stood still, like you taught me in the long gallery. I stood still and I let you get there." And she said it as a simple statement of fact, the way she said everything, and it undid me more than any thanks could have, because she was right and she was wrong at once. Right that I got there, wrong, terribly wrong, that standing still was the safe thing, and yet her standing still had, by the smallest margin, been the thing that let me put myself between her and the barrel, instead of chasing a running child across a colonnade while a frightened man swung a gun. She had trusted the guard from the arch. She had trusted the decoration. And the decoration had been, on that one morning, worthy of a 9-year-old's trust, and I do not think I have ever in my life been paid a higher wage than that. The Crown Prince Rowan came to me before the luncheon. He found me where I had gone to make myself fit to sit at his father's table, a small guardroom off the lower court where I had cleaned the grime off my tunic as best I could, and washed the driver's blood from my glove and set my knocked bearskin to rights, and stood a moment alone, letting my hands shake now that there was no one to see them shake, because they do shake after always, and the man who tells you his do not is lying to you or has done less than he claims. Rowan came in without ceremony and shut the door, and stood looking at me with the intense, controlled attention he had inherited from neither his careful father nor his warm-hearted wife, but from somewhere all his own. My daughter was at that rail, he said. Yes, Highness. You knew who was at that rail when you dropped your rifle and went in with your hands. It was not quite a question. Rowan had clearly already spoken to Corwin, to Halden, to whoever could tell him the shape of the thing, and had worked it through in that relentless way of his. You could have fired from the stair. You chose not to, because a shot in that yard with the horse and the colonnade, you could not guarantee where it ended. So you crossed the open ground under a leveled gun, unarmed by choice, to make certain the round went into the sky and not into my child. Is that the shape of it? That is the shape of it, Highness, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question that told me he was going to be a very great king someday, when his father set the weight down at last, because it was not the question of a man counting up a debt but the question of a man trying to understand a thing at its root. Why are you standing an arch, he said, if you can do that? Why in 11 years has no one? Why does my father have a man who can cross a yard like that under a gun and end it clean, standing in a doorway being flicked on the cap by foreign commanders? So I told him. I had never told anyone in the palace the whole of it. The household keeps its quiet men quiet, and I had been content to be kept. But Rowan had earned it in that guardroom with that question, and I told him. The Warden's reach. The 11 years in the marches before the 11 in the red tunic. The Coldwater passes and the hold at Ashford and the 7 of 9 I brought home and the 2 I did not. The shoulder. The decoration I was not permitted to wear. And the reason a king keeps such a man standing in plain sight among the ceremonial line. Because the honor of a throne must be guarded, yes, but it must be guarded in a way that no watching enemy can count or map. And the surest way to hide a hard man is to dress him exactly like the soft ones, and set him in a doorway where every eye slides off him as a decoration. Your father's grandfather began the practice, Highness, I said. A few of us, in every generation, threaded through the line. No mark, no rank shown, no difference a watching man could find. The whole strength of it is that you cannot tell. Commander Havard could not tell. Neither, forgive me, could you until this morning. That is not a failure of yours. That is the design working exactly as it is meant to work. Rowan took that in. And then he did a thing I did not expect. He crossed the small guardroom and took my hand, the right hand, the one that had washed a man's blood off it an hour before, and he held it in both of his, and he said, "Then the design cost you your name for 11 years, so that it might work on the one morning it was needed. That is a hard wage. I will not undo it. I understand now why it must be secret, but I will know it. My children will know it when they are old enough to keep it. You will not be a decoration in this house again, whatever the world sees." And that, from Rowan, was a covenant, and I have held him to it, and he has never once failed it in all the years since. The luncheon should have been cancelled. By every ordinary measure of a court, a gunshot in the lower yard and a bound man led away in the middle of a state visit is the end of the day's ceremony. You close the doors, you make your apologies to the delegation, you send everyone home to write their careful reports. But King Alaric would not cancel it, and I came to understand why, and it was the shrewdest thing I saw him do in 11 years of watching him reign. "If we cancel," he said, "I heard this later from Aldous, who was in the room, we tell the coast, and everyone the coast will tell that a broken farmer with a bird gun can stop the king's table. We will not tell them that. We will sit down to luncheon, exactly as planned, 1 hour late, and we will do it calmly, and the commander will see a kingdom that a gunshot does not shake. And the man who ended it in my yard will sit at my right hand, and the commander will look at him across the salt for 2 hours, and he will draw his own conclusions." The old soldier had not entirely been worn out of the old king after all. So I sat at the king's right hand, in a fresh tunic sent down from the household stores, with my hands steady again, because I had let them shake in private and gotten it over with. And across the long table sat Commander Havard of the coastal delegation, in his sea-blue coat heavy with braid, and for the first hour he barely spoke. I want to be fair to Havard, because the easy telling makes him a fool, and he was not a fool. A fool would have blustered. A fool would have found some way to make the morning smaller, to say that of course any soldier could have done it, that it was luck, that the farmer was harmless. Havard did none of that. He sat and he ate little, and he watched me the way a man watches a thing he has misjudged and is trying honestly to recalibrate against. And when at last he spoke to me, near the end of the meal, over the king and half the table, he did it plainly and without flinching, and that took its own kind of courage. "This morning," he said in our tongue, and the table quieted around him the way a table does when a great man decides to say a true thing, "I told you that you were a decoration. I walked around you and I lectured your king's steward on the uselessness of ceremony. I flicked your cap." He set down his cup. "I have commanded men for 30 years. I have led them onto walls and off ships and into places I do not speak of at tables. And I have never, I say this so that the men at this table hear me say it, I have never seen a soldier close a gun the way you closed that one. Not fired at it, closed it. Under the muzzle with your hands so the round went to the sky. My best men, my sworn best, would have fired from the stair and prayed. You did the harder thing, and you did it for a child at a rail, and you did it wearing the tunic I told you was for looking at." He inclined his head, not a bow. A commander does not bow to another man's guardsman, but the grave downward tilt one professional gives another, the physical form of the word his aide had heard in the yard. "I was wrong about the tunic," he said. "I was wrong about you. And I begin to think I was wrong about ceremony, which I have spent 30 years despising, because it seems that a kingdom that keeps its discipline dressed as ornament keeps something my armies do not keep, and this morning it kept a child alive. I will carry that home. Whatever else comes of this visit, I will carry that home. It was, I have always thought, the more valuable thing that came out of the state visit, more valuable than the accord of safe passage they signed that afternoon, though that mattered too. A hard, honest man had walked up a stair believing that ceremony was theater and discipline was a costume, and he walked down it that evening having watched the costume put a bird gun into the sky over a child's head, and he changed his mind in front of his own aides, out loud, which is the hardest thing a proud man ever does. I have wondered since, how many of his own quiet men, for surely a commander that shrewd kept a few threaded through his own ranks, he looked at differently on the voyage home. I hope it was all of them. I hope somewhere on that far coast there is now a doorway with a hard man standing in it dressed as a decoration, and a commander who knows better than to flick his cap. But I have run ahead again, past a thing that happened at that same luncheon that I have not told you, and that I must, because it is the part of the day that had nothing to do with the commander and everything to do with the house I served, and because it is the reason a certain great lady of the court did not look at me, all through that meal, and has not looked kindly at me since. The Queen Consort Morwenna was at the table. She was the king's second wife, married these 7 years, since 2 years after Isolde died, a proud, cold, handsome woman with a grown son of her own, Lord Cassius, from a prior marriage, and a way of moving through the court that made even the loyal careful. And Morwenna had that morning been among those who counseled most strongly that the young royal children should be present at the review in the forecourt, had, in fact, over Princess Alara's quiet reluctance, been the deciding voice for Malin and Torrin standing at that rail. I do not say she meant harm by it. I have no proof she did, and I will not manufacture one. The honest telling forbids it. She meant, I think, to show the delegation the whole house, and to be seen to have arranged it, for the Queen Consort loved to be seen to have arranged things. But it was her arrangement that had put Malin at the rail, and everyone at that table knew it, and it hung in the air over the meal like a thing no one would name. And I, sitting at the king's right hand with the whole story of the morning still on me, was the living evidence of how near her arrangement had come to catastrophe. That is why she would not look at me. A woman like the Queen Consort does not thank the man whose existence proves how close her pride came to costing the house a child. She resents him. She resents that he was there, that he saw, that he acted, that he now sits at the king's right hand receiving honor for undoing what her arranging had nearly done. I saw all of that in the one flat glance she gave me when she thought I was not watching, and I filed it away the way you file a tree line that has gone too quiet, because a man who has stood the reach knows that the enemy who comes up the ramp with a bird gun is not always the most dangerous one at the table, and that the cold ones who resent you for saving the child are a slower and a subtler weather, and worth the watching. I have watched the queen consort ever since. That, though, is another set of mornings and other stories. What I will say of Morwenna here is only this, and it is fair. When Princess Alara rose near the end of the luncheon, and did the thing that no one had asked her to do, came the length of the table, past the delegation, past the king himself, to where I sat, and took my blood-scrubbed right hand in both of hers in front of the entire court and said, simply, "You gave me my daughter this afternoon. I will not forget it, and I will not let this house forget it." When Alara did that, the whole table warmed and rose and honored me with her. And the queen consort rose too, because she had to, and lifted her cup with the rest and drank. She drank to me because the room required it. But she drank looking at the far wall, and her cup came down again untouched to her lips, and I marked that too. The court saw a queen consort honoring the guard who saved the princess. I saw a woman drinking to a man she would rather had not existed. Both were in the room. That is how a real court is, the warm thing and the cold thing at the same table, and the guard the only one sober enough to see both. The review went forward in the late afternoon, and I have kept it for last among the day's ceremonies, because it is where the whole argument of the morning came round to its close, in front of everyone, in the open forecourt, in the light. By rights, I should not have stood the review at all. A man who has been through what I had been through since dawn is stood down, sent to rest, questioned and written up and sent to his bunk. But King Alaric ordered otherwise, and I have told you he was shrewd, and this was the shrewdest ordering of the lot. He ordered that the review of the household guard proceed exactly as planned in full honors before the whole delegation, and that I stand in it, not at its head, not decorated, not pointed out, not set apart, in it. In my place in the ceremonial line, one still red figure among the still red figures, exactly as I had stood 10,000 mornings, exactly as Commander Havard had first seen me and thought me hollow. I understood the order the moment I heard it, and I have never admired the old king more. He was making the argument physical. He was standing his whole ceremonial line up in the forecourt in front of a foreign commander who now knew, beyond any doubt, that one of those still red figures had that morning crossed a yard under a gun and put a bird gun in the sky with his hands, and he was refusing to tell the commander which one. He set us all in the line, identical, immaculate, unbreakable, and he let Havard walk it. He let the commander pass down the whole rank of us, looking and not know, was it that one? That one, the tall one on the end, the broad one at the center, the still one by the arch, every one of them a decoration, commander, every one of them perhaps the man from the yard. You cannot tell. That is the whole of it. That was always the whole of it. You will go home to your far coast, and you will never be able to say which of the King of Eldermoor's ceremonial guards are ornaments, and which are the hard men threaded through them dressed as ornaments, because you cannot tell, and neither can any watching enemy, and that not being able to tell is worth more to this throne than any wall you ever stood a man on. I stood the review in my place in the line, and I held the honor, and I did not move, and Commander Havard walked the rank slowly with the king, and when he came level with me he paused the smallest fraction, a half-step's hesitation, because some soldier's instinct in him wondered, and then he passed on, because he could not tell, because there was nothing to tell him, because I was a still red figure among still red figures with my eyes level on the far pillar, and the ceremonial nothing on my face. He passed me by, and that passing by, that not knowing, was the sweetest vindication the whole long day had given me, sweeter than the king's fingers on my cap, sweeter than Rowan's covenant, sweeter even than Alara's hands and Malin's grave trust, because it was the design itself, the 11 years' patience of it, standing up in the afternoon light and working exactly as it was built to work, in front of the very man who had said it could not. That night I did not sleep, and I want to set down why. Because a story that ends at the vindication is a story that has lied to you about the price. I have said the hands shake after, and that is true, and it is the small part. The large part comes at night in the dark, when the work is done and there is nothing left to rule and read and organize, and the mind, which held itself perfectly still and clear through the whole of the yard, because it had to, finally lets in the thing it would not let itself feel while there was still a job to do. And the thing it lets in is not the man on the cart. It is the margin. It is how thin the margin was. It is the knowledge, arriving all at once at some black hour, that if the driver's hands had been a little steadier and his fear a little slower to break, if he had not stood up on the box a fraction too early, if I had read the tree line of that yard one heartbeat later, if the king's stare had held me 3 seconds more, that the round I put into the sky would have gone somewhere else, into the colonnade, into the rail, into a small dark-eyed figure who stood still because she trusted the guard from the arch to get there. I got there. But I lay awake all that night at the exact width of asterisk, barely asterisk, and I have lain awake at that width many nights since, and I will tell any young guardsman who asks me. That width is the true wage of the work, and no king's fingers on your cap will pay it off. You carry it. You carry it so that other people do not have to. That is what the tunic is for, under the wool and the polish. That is the thing Commander Havard did not know to look for, and could not have flicked out of me with 2 fingers, because it is not on the outside. It is the weight a man agrees to carry in the dark so that a court may dance in the light and never know how near the music came to stopping. I went, in the gray of the next morning, to see the farmer. I did not have to. He was in the officer of the day's charge, questioned and held, and it was no part of my duty. But I have never been able to end a thing at the pin. The reach spoiled me for that or made me whole. I have never decided which. I wanted to see the man whose ruin had come up my ramp, because the honest part of me, the part that had heard the farmer's second answer under the first, could not rest until I had looked at him as a man and not as a target. They let me into him. He was a small, worn person, smaller than he had looked on the box. With the ruined farmer's hands I had read from 80 paces, and when he understood who I was, the guard from the arch, the one who had put him down, he flinched back against the wall and waited to be struck, because a lifetime had taught him that men in fine tunics who have power over you strike you. I did not strike him. I sat down across from him on the cold floor of that cell in my off-duty coat, and I said, "Tell me about your daughter." And he wept again, and he told me, and it was the story I have already given you, the land and the lender and the court and the sickness. And it was true, every word of it. I could hear that it was true. And when he was done, I did not tell him he was forgiven, because he was not. A man does not bring a gun up a ramp toward children and walk away forgiven, and I would not insult his grief by pretending otherwise. But I told him the one true thing I had the standing to tell him, which was this: you wanted the throne to see you. It saw you, not the way you meant. But I will carry your daughter's name up to men who can do something about the losing of land, because I sat here and I heard it, and that is more of a hearing than you would have gotten from a bird gun, which would only have gotten your name burned and your family scattered, and your daughter remembered as a madman's excuse. You are going to answer for what you did, but your daughter is going to be heard. I give you my word on it, and my word is not a small thing where I come from. And I kept that word. It is the least told part of this whole account, and I have come to think, the most important, because it is the part where ceremony and its underside were reconciled instead of merely opposed. I took the farmer's daughter's story, the land, the lender, the grinding legal ruin of a working family, up through the one channel a guard of my standing had, which was the crown prince, who had told me in a guardroom that I would not be a decoration in his house again. Rowan heard it. Rowan, who was going to be a very great king, did the thing his father was too old and too tired to do, and his stepmother would never have wanted done. He looked into the quiet legal machinery by which men like that farmer lost their land, and he found it rotten in places, and he began slowly, it is always slow, to mend it. Not because of the gun, because of the hearing. Because a hard guard with a spoiled conscience sat down on a cell floor and listened, and carried a dead girl's name upward, and a prince who kept his covenants acted on it. That is the truest answer the whole day ever gave to Commander Havard's question about whether ceremony means anything. It means exactly as much as the men underneath it are willing to carry, the gun in the yard and the grief in the cell, and not 1 ounce more. The delegation sailed 3 days later. The accord of safe passage was signed. The speeches were made. The harbor was full of the bright banners of a state visit ending well, and if you had stood at the balustrade that morning and watched the coastal ships take the tide, you would have seen nothing but ceremony. The very thing Commander Havard had come believing was empty. He came to the harbor gate to make his farewells, and the household stood the ceremonial route one last time, and I was posted, at my own request, back at the head of the King's Stair, at the arch in my place. He stopped in front of me on his way down. His aides went ahead, he stopped alone, and for a moment we were as we had been on the first morning, the broad commander in sea blue, the still guard in red, the same arch, the same stair. He looked at me a long time. He could not know for certain even then that I was the man from the yard. The king had left him that uncertainty on purpose, and I would not take it from the king, but he suspected. Some soldiers' weight in him had settled on me and would not lift. He did not flick my cap. That more than anything he said told me the whole thing had landed. A man who understands the discipline underneath the polish does not test it with 2 fingers. He honors it by leaving it alone. Instead, Commander Havard stood to attention fully, formally, the way one soldier stands to another, not the way a great man acknowledges a doorman, and he brought his hand up in a salute, a real one, held at the proper beat and lowered it. To me, to the decoration. To whichever of us in that line was the man from the yard, and therefore to all of us, which was exactly the point, and I think he knew it. "I do not know your name," he said quietly, "and I understand now that I am not meant to, but I know what you are. Guard your king well." And he turned and went down the stair to his ships, and I never saw him again, and I have always counted him, despite everything, an honest man, because the measure of an honest man is not that he never misjudges, but that he can stand in the wreck of his own certainty and say, out loud, "I was wrong," and mean it and change. He did all 3. Few men do. I went back to my arch. That is where this account should end, and nearly does, with the guard back at his post, the honor held, the storm past, the stillness resumed. It is the shape the niche of my whole life takes, over and over. The storm comes, the storm is met, the stillness returns, and the returning is not defeat but the very thing the storm was meant to protect. I stood that arch for 6 more years after the morning of the flower cart, and stood 1,000 more mornings of tourists and delegations and rain, and was flicked on the cap by other fools and lectured on the uselessness of ceremony by other clever men. And I let it all go past me as I had always let it go past me, because I knew a thing they did not, and knowing it was enough. But there is one last morning I will give you, because it is the one I keep, and it belongs to the smallest and most important person in this whole account. It was perhaps a month after the state visit. The palace had long since returned to its ordinary rhythm. The flower cart was a closed file and a bad dream. The farmer was serving his sentence, and his daughter's name was already, quietly, beginning to change the law. I was at my arch at the head of the King's Stair, at the changing of the watch, and the long gallery ran off to my left in its long slant of morning light. And down that gallery, grave and slow and entirely deliberate, came Princess Malin, 9 years old, dark-eyed, alone but for the nurse who now, since that morning, was never more than a careful few steps behind her. She walked the length of the gallery toward me. And as she came, she matched her small, slow steps to the rhythm of the watch, left, right, left, exactly as she had done at 7, gravely, all the way, keeping perfect time with the changing guard, a private ceremony of her own devising between the child who saw the guards and the guard who stood the arch. She came all the way to me and stopped and looked up, and we did not speak, because speaking was not part of it and never had been. She simply looked at me for a moment with Isolde's steady eyes, and I looked back level, the ceremonial nothing on my face and everything in the world behind it, and something passed between us that needed no words and would have survived none. Then she nodded, a small, complete, entirely serious nod, the nod of one person acknowledging another across a distance they both understood, and she turned and walked back up the gallery the way she had come, matching her steps to the watch the whole way, and the light took her, and she was gone, and I stood my arch. She had trusted the decoration, and the decoration had turned out to be a guardian dressed as a decoration, threaded quietly into the line so that no watching enemy could count him, and had crossed a yard under a gun to be worthy of a 9-year-old's trust, and would do it again, and again, 1,000 times in the dark and unthanked, for as long as there was a doorway to stand and a child to stand it for. Commander Havard thought it was just ceremony. He was not the first and will not be the last. Let them think it. Let the whole world walk up the stair and see a fine, expensive ornament in the doorway and think it hollow and flick its cap and pass on satisfied. The ornament will hold the door. And on the one morning in 10,000 when the real thing comes up the ramp, the gun, the grief, the small figure at the rail who stood still and trusted, the ornament will move faster than they ever dreamed a decoration could move, and put the thing into the sky, and set the world right and step back into the line and be still again. That is the whole of it. That is what the tunic is for. Stand the arch, hold the honor, carry the weight in the dark. And when the door needs a man and not an ornament, be the man the ornament was always hiding. They will never be able to tell which of us it is. That was always the whole of it.